Ladies and gentlemen, dear listeners, good morning from Prisma, here with Michael Michos and Mikos Maskopsaris. Today we have the honor and joy to have with us a special guest, an author, a writer, a person of great importance, Mr. Andrew Pippos from Australia. Dr. Pippos, good morning from Greece.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
The pleasure is ours. And first of all, I would like to mention a few things about Andrew Peoples. Andrew Peoples spent part of his childhood getting underfoot in his family Greek Australian cafe. When he grew up, he worked in newspapers and taught in universities. Lucky's in his first novel, and it packs in everything he knows about growing up in a noisy, complicated, loving family. He lives in Sydney, where he is a lecturer at the School of Communication, University of Technology, Sydney. First of all, I would like to ask you to tell us here in Greece a bit about yourself, Mr. Adrio.
Okay, well, I live in Sydney, as you've mentioned, and I've spent most of my life in this city. But I've also lived in London, in Seoul, the capital city of South Korea, and also in Canberra, the capital city of Australia. I've worked in newspapers, but now I'm a lecturer in creative writing at the University of Technology in Sydney. And Lucky's is my first novel, my first book, but I've also written short stories and essays and journalism here and there. My next book will be a work of narrative nonfiction. And my surname is Pippos. The family is from the Greek island of Ithaki, from Vathi, the village, the main port village of the island. And that's a little bit about me.
Well, very interesting. What is your relationship with writing looking back on your childhood?
Um, well, I think the writing that I did as a child and as a teenager isn't terribly important, and it's actually not something that I really think about. Um, but much more important in my childhood is really my love of stories,
The love of
of of
stories.
of literature, of narrative, in general. All children want stories. Small children, they want to play. They want food, and they want stories. Whether that's a book, whether that's television, a film, whether that's a story that their parents or their uncles or aunts or grandparents tell them. That there's a basic human necessity for story that all people share. Um, for me, the earliest stories that I loved, truly loved, was Greek mythology.
Greek
My
mythology.
Yeah, and that was like when I was a small child, I was into Greek myths, and of course the families from Ithaki, Ithaca is an important island in Greek mythology. So I knew this at a very young age, but I was interested in lots of different myths, and I was fortunate enough to have some relatives who were good storytellers. They were, as we say in English, good raconteurs. They knew how to tell a story, and they could talk about the Greek myths as if they were, things that, as if it was like gossip, as if these things had happened to people who lived, across the street. Um, and of course, this interest in Greek mythology as I got older led to an interest in when I was a teenager in novels and poems. All of Western literature is grounded in Greek mythology. That's the Odyssey and the Iliad. These are the texts of all of Western European literature, and you could take it further and say American and Australian literature as well, given the how much that those newer literatures draw on the European tradition. So, look, what is important to me when I think about my childhood is not my writing, but it's my love of literature. And I became a writer because I wanted to contribute to an art form that has, given me so much. You know, you become an artist, any kind of artist, because you love other people's art. And that's always, as far as I can tell, a significant part of the conversion story, the conversion from just not knowing what to do to knowing that you want to create art, to create literature. So literature has helped me, stories have helped me to better understand, you know, familiar places, experiences that I've had myself, as well as experiences that I haven't had, that I could never have. And it's helped me understand people who are emphatically not like me, not like the people that I've known. You know, literature has confronted me. It's left me feeling uplifted. And, you know, I think that there are truths about life that are best expressed, you know, in the form of a fictional narrative.
Of fictional narrative and
Mm.
Greek mythology encapsulate this journey, the adventure, to
Mm.
discover more and more about real life and to
Mm.
bring the fantasy into the arm of the reality. That's a
Yeah,
great importance for a writer, for an author. And the other question has to be with your favorite genre in literature:
I
fiction,
think.
non-fiction, no-
Hmm, I
novel,
mean, I
poetry.
think. I mean, I love them all. You know, poems, essays, memoir, short stories, plays. But if I had to choose, it would probably be the novel. There's something about the messiness of the novel, the imperfection of it, that I really love. You can do quite a lot with, you know, time and psychology, and you can include multiple storylines. There's just a lot more possible with narrative in the novel genre.
Yes, that's very interesting. Do you think people and culture change throughout the year or not?
Um, yeah, I think we do. You know, we change a lot. Um, I think that cultures change. You know, our codes of behavior change. You know, we don't have duels anymore in the street. We don't pursue blood feuds. You know, our society is a lot more equal than it was 100 years ago. Look, you know, the effect of feminism is quite extraordinary in that sense. Women have a different position in society now compared with what they did in the 19th century. You know, so we're still connected to the idea of progress. We depend on progress. That's where we find hope. You know, the idea that things can change, that we can find um, new ways of doing old things. But you know, again, we can go backwards very easily as a society. You know, war will often takes societies backwards, or plagues, for example. Um, but generally, I think that the curve of history is towards change, towards progress. And I think people do change throughout their lives, and that's a complex issue, and it changes from person to person. I think some people change for the better, and some don't change for the better. They change for the worse, and that's always the sad. That's always the sad outcome.
Yes. Somebody change, somebody knows, no, depending on the conditions, on the situation, the particular situation. Exactly. Now,
Yeah.
about Lucky's. One question would have to be for those listening who haven't yet read the book. Could you give a brief summary of Lucky's?
It's a book that has been described as an epic, and in a sense, in terms of the time frame of the book, it it is. I guess it is a kind of an epic. It spans about 80 years, mostly in the 20th century, and it's a story about the changing fortunes of a man nicknamed Lucky. Um, his the so the novel traces almost his entire life, but it's also about the people whose lives, in some meaningful way, intersect with his. You know, it's also about the people whose lives he shapes and who shapes him. It's a novel about Greek immigrants to Australia and their cafes. In terms of theme, it's about the pursuit of love and family and friendship, the rise and fall of a restaurant franchise. And we see the characters in the novel respond to failure and grief and tragedy. Thematically, it's also about, you know, deception, you know, what role lying plays in our lives, for better and for worse. So there are lots of different storylines that take place within this 80-year frame, but they all converge, and they all converge really at the site of the Lucky's Cafe franchise, which is why I called the book Lucky's.
Yes. Do you think that migration is a tragedy in relation to somebody's losing his traditional roots?
It's a really complex question. And the way that I understand it, I think is probably peculiar to being a Greek Australian and having a sense of, you know, uncles and my grandparents, you know, Greekness and like being part of that, but also not being part of that. So I think something is lost, and they lost something coming here. And all migrants to places like England and Australia and America, they lose something of their identity. But you can never fully lose your ethnicity, because there's no such thing as a generalized human being. Everybody has some trace of their past in them, in their being, but you do lose some sense of purity in a way. But I sometimes wonder, what good is ethnic purity anyway? In the process of migration, we become a kind of another kind of person. You mix with other cultures, you become something new, a new kind of mixture. And, you know, for some people, that's a good thing. You know, newness is a good thing. It's not a tragedy to be part of a multicultural society, to be a bit of this and a bit of that. You're sort of unique in a way. So that's the way that I think of it. And I've never like wanted to be more this or more that. I've always just understood like my ethnicity, my nationality, my identity as this thing that's a mixture of different identities and different influences. You know, like, you know, have a sort of, like, my last surname is Greek, and my grandparents and some of my uncles and aunts migrated from Greece. And I've lived in different countries, and I'm a man, and I'm sort of heterosexual, and I have a family, and I love literature, and I have all these things that sort of impact on my identity. I could keep listing things, but it's hard to know, you know, how much of one I am. There's no measuring stick that can tell you like exactly which proportions I am of each influence on my identity. So living in a multicultural society like Australia, I see myself as just a mixture of things, like everyone that I live with.
Yes, it is a great experience, a great life experience to this mixture of things of a global civilization.
Mm.
In the novel, your hero, Lucky, is Greek Australian. In this
Mm.
context, you challenge topics of migration, racism, and multiculturalism in Australia at that time. What do you hope your readers will take away from your explorations of these topics?
I think that the impact of my writing is not something that I can wholly design. In a story, you describe a particular set of characters in a particular setting. And when the novel is published, you need to let the story go, and the reader will make of it what they will. I would hope that they see the panorama in the novel. I hope that they see how the events in the novel are connected, how the characters have influenced each other's lives. I hope that they grasp certain structural things about the book. I didn't design the book with a message. And I think a lot of literature that I like, it doesn't come with a moral or a message. It's really an experience for the reader. It's more complex than that. It's a narrative, and it's about how characters are face certain obstacles in their lives, and sometimes they make decisions that the reader disagrees with. Sometimes they make decisions that the reader can credit, can applaud. I think that in terms of multiculturalism and racism in the Australian context, I think that this book it covers a span of time where Australia changes quite radically in its attitude to migration in the early parts of and that's sort of followed in the trajectory of the novel, and it's a sub theme in the book. It's not something that I wanted to bang the desk about because I'm more interested in emotions than trying to write political literature. But it is there in the book. There's no question that the book does sort of is involved in the question of migration in Australia. So the early chapters of the book happen in a period that Australian historians call the assimilation era. And in that era, migrants were encouraged to change their names, to not serve. If they worked in restaurants, they really couldn't sell Greek food or Italian food or Chinese food. They had to prepare Anglo food. There was this pressure from all sides, economically, culturally, in terms of in terms of relationships, for example, a lot of the migrants were men, so they were marrying Anglo women. For example, there was a mixture of people being constructed that the migrants' lives were sort of being manipulated in a sense by all these different forces in Australian culture, and this went on until really the 70s. And then Australia changes quite a lot in the 1970s. It becomes we sort of start using the term multiculturalism. Multiculturalism means it has a lot of different meanings, but in terms of the migration policy of Australia in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, multiculturalism means that there's less pressure to assimilate and to change, that migrants come to Australia and keep their language and keep their names, and are encouraged to open restaurants or to do whatever they want with their food, and to be open with their own culture, not to try and hide it. For example, in the Greek cafes that are at the center of the book, Lucky's, they sort of spring up in Australia, and are really the most popular restaurants in Australia, really in the first half of the 20th century. And this is the assimilation era. And these are people who often worked in restaurants in Greece, or they were good cooks. They knew how to cook well. That was their skill. And when they came to Australia, they couldn't cook Greek food, so they had to cook Anglo food, steaks and chips and things like this. And They did cook Greek food, but they only cooked it, and I remember this from visiting my relatives' cafes, is that they were amazing cooks when it came to Greek food, but it was always cooked on a particular part of the stove, towards the back, and it was served only to family members for lunch or for dinner after the cafe was closed. And that's how it was for decades. During the assimilation era, migrants kind of kept their culture secret. It was just a private thing that you did in your home. If you owned a restaurant, you did it in a particular part of the stove. You didn't serve it to customers. You didn't, you didn't show customers the food that you didn't serve them the food that you cooked best. So that changed in the 70s with the official migration policy of multiculturalism, and all of which is a kind of a long way of saying the novel traces that trajectory in Australian culture, and you see it change.
Exactly. Very, very interesting ideas. Why does it mean to you the literal revival of one traditional Australian cafe as a source of a particular institution?
I think see, I'm a bit, I can't be objective about this because, I come from the Greek cafe culture and, the Australian Greek cafe culture, which is described in this book. And these were Greek migrants who started these cafes, and they were very popular restaurants, but they didn't serve Greek food. They were often very, that design was Art Deco. So you had jukeboxes, you had all these kind of American Art Deco design. You had soda fountains, those checkerboard floors. Everything was kind of sleek and shiny. It was those cafes, even though they were cruel in a way that, my uncles and aunts and my grandparents, they couldn't cook the food that they loved and that they knew how to cook. There was that side of it was interesting because it sort of spoke to Australian history in a way, but it also spoke to sort of migrant hopes and dreams, that even though these restaurants, these businesses were compromises, they were also successful. And the other quirk about them is that the families always lived in rooms at the back of the restaurant. So they were not just a business, but they were homes. It also spoke to just the work ethic of Greek migrants. Like, it's not something that, I think this was better known in another period of history, but the Greeks who came to Australia in the 20th century, particularly in the mid 20th century, they were the hardest workers in the country. They worked 7 days a week from early in the morning until late at night. They were in cafes or factories. They were extraordinary people who did it all for their families and basically outworked other people in Australian society, and that's how they managed to sort of get ahead and to bring people into the middle class, the Australian middle class. Like, even though my parents were working class, they had working class childhoods. I had a middle class childhood. So there was this class shift that happened in the cafes. They were vehicles for migration. They were often, in Australian outer suburbs or in the country towns, which are very isolated. Like, it's very difficult, unless you've been to Australia and traveled around, it's hard to sort of explain to people in Europe how isolated some of these country towns are in outback Australia. They really are like little islands, and there was always a Greek cafe in these little towns, and they were really the place where everybody went. And so they were social hubs in a way. And also the other thing that they were was they showed Australia for the first time the American culture as well. So there were jukeboxes, for example. Some of the food was American. There were soda fountains. So they were these weird mixtures of all these different cultures: Anglo, American, Greek. They were really, I was talking earlier before about the hybrid identity and the sense of newness. Well, the cafes were new things, whatever they were. There were good things about them and bad things about them, but what they were they were new. They represented newness in Australian society, and they no longer exist anymore because they for two reasons really. Like everyone who had these cafes, they had children who were middle class like me who went on to do other things. I didn't want to spend 7 days working in a cafe. I wanted to write books and work in newspapers and teach at university. I wanted to have a different kind of life. And that's what my parents and grandparents wanted for me too. That's what they worked for. But the other thing is that the food became uncool. It's and the style of restaurants in Australia with multiculturalism became a lot more varied. I can, if I walk out, I can go to Thai restaurants, I can go to a Serbian restaurant, I can go to a Greek restaurant, I can go to an African restaurant, I can go to all these different, I can have all these different cuisines, even modern Australian cuisine. So all these types of restaurants that weren't possible before became possible. And with that sort of development in Australian restaurant culture, the Greek cafes slowly started disappearing, and they're all gone now. So it's a lost world of a sort. And I was interested in writing about a lost world too, because it was the lost world of my childhood, and it's a lost world in Australian culture. And yeah.
Well, I would like to tell us a few things about the time frame of your book, the particular atmosphere that it represents, and the meaning of passing time in the plot of your story.
Well, the time frame of the novel again is very broad. It's about 80 years. The effect of time is that one of the things that I was interested in exploring was opportunities for change, for second chances, for people to, preserve the truth about the past, or to tell a different story about the past. Lucky, in one instance, tells a character a lie, but he does that in order to just bury the truth, because the truth is unpleasant and it doesn't benefit anybody for if he tells her the truth about something that happened many years before. So there's a theme of deception in the book that is sustained throughout the book, and the deception is sometimes seen as a dangerous thing that can lead people into trouble, but it's also seen as a way of maintaining relationships, or a way of healing the past, for example, by lying about it. I know it seems a bit vague because I'm not describing the specifics of the plot, because I'm talking about the ending of the book. But again and again in the novel, time, and what happens to the characters is they have opportunities to make amends, or to do something else, to do something new. And That's it. I was often reminded of the quote from Don Quixote, even though, when he rides out to try to be a knight one last time, he says, it's all life. Like I'm still alive. And I think the quote is, "It's all life until I'm dead." But what Don Quixote is trying to say is that that there's always hope for something else, some sort of change, some new experience, and that's what my characters are going through in this book. It's never really over. They're never really settled. There's always there's a lot of disappointment in the book, and there's a lot of tragedy, but there are always chances. Yeah.
What is the secret of the spiritual strength of your main character?
I think that Lucky is someone who just doesn't give up. And he is a sort of trickster character. He will lie. He gambles. He does these things that aren't always pleasant, but he loves people, and what he's always looking for is a way to be good, and he wants friendship, and he wants community, and he wants family. He didn't really have these things. He didn't experience these things as much as he would have hoped in his life, but late in life he's trying to find community once again. And so his secret strength is just the fact that he can't be defeated. He's undefeated.
He's undefeated.
Mm.
Well, have you ever visited Greece?
Yes, of course. And when we go, we always go to Ithaki. It's a really beautiful island, and I'm looking forward to going back there. It was the last time I went was a few years ago, and we visited my father's cousin, who was someone I call my uncle, who lived in Australia for a few years but didn't like it and came back to Greece. And I would go. We visited him. I was there with my girlfriend, and we visited him every day and drank his homemade wine, and he told lots of stories about when he was a young man, and when he was in the army, and he was a boy during the Second World War, and talked about the occupation, and he talked about the Civil War, and he told stories about the earthquake in Ithaki in the 1950s, and all these stories. It was amazing to just sit there and listen to him talk. But he died about 3 years ago. So not long after I visited, he died. So it was really going back. It will be, Ithaca will be different without him.
I understand. Very, very difficult.
Yes, because he had like the whole history of the island, in his head, and he had stories, and he was a very funny person, and I often think of him as the kind of person that could only exist on that island. But he had a long life, he lived well into his 80s. So he had a long life, but I still, you still miss people when they're gone, no matter how old they are.
Yes. And in Greek poetry, Ithaki incarnates the symbol of the journey. The journey to discover more and more an adventure. like in the case of the poet Cavafis.
Yes.
What is
Yes,
the yes?
that is a great poem. Yeah, and that's a poem that always has meant a lot to me. And
Yes,
even my father, who never read a book in his whole life, he always loved that poem as well.
yes, it's the journey and the strength of the human being to fight
Mm.
for the life. To in this context, what is the significance for you to be a member of a traditional family
Um,
with Greek roots as well?
yeah. I think the significance is kind of it's it's something that I think about all the time. But I don't really understand. I mean, I sort of think that I'm traditional in some ways, but not in others. You know, I don't speak Greek particularly well. Um, the I have my father's komboloi, which was also belonged to my papu and my pro-papu, and like it goes back so far in the family. I can just look at these worry beads and think, how many people have held on to it, and now it's come down to me. It's of all the people, and so I think it's something that I'm very grateful for. I'm very grateful for being, even though I'm not an expert in traditional Greek culture, getting some sense of it through family members has been a real sort of blessing for me, and also um, just also being the beneficiary of their hard work. They worked very hard in Greece, and then when they came to Australia, they worked extremely hard, and they did it all really to give their family a better life. And there's no way that without those sacrifices, without my grandfather working 7 days a week from 6 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock at night, really his entire life, or most of his adult life anyway. I wouldn't be able to, have a position at a university and to have book deals and to sit around making up stories. That's all these things that I enjoy in my life. I sort of owe to some extent to the sacrifices they made. So that's often what I think about when I think about my family and my grandparents, and even further back than that. And also, it's kind of amazing to come from Ithaca to have this to have a the surname Pippos is a kind of like a well-known surname in Greece. It's in Ithaca. Um,
Do you feel
and
more?
yeah,
Excuse, excuse me, Andrew. Do you feel more of an academic teacher, as you said, or a writer? It is easy to combine the two fields.
I definitely feel like more of a writer than a teacher. I think all my teaching is informed by my writing and what I learn when I sit down to write. Everything comes from that. Otherwise, it's not authentic. It's just something that it would be something that I've read about teaching. I think that the writing comes first and then the teaching comes second. It's not always easy to balance them. Universities in Australia are increasingly more complex as places to work, where you're expected to do more and more work, and there's a lot of administration work to do. So it can be difficult to balance. the two. And you go through periods. What I find is that there are periods when I'm good at balancing it, and then there are periods when I'm really bad at it, where I've just focused too much on the teaching, or I focus too much on the writing. So it's a very delicate game. It's like juggling. So, as I get older, I hope to get better at the juggling.
What are your future literary plans?
It's always difficult to talk about them because you never know what happens. But I have a contract for the next book, which is a book of narrative nonfiction. It's not quite memoir, but it's a bit like a memoir. But it's really about my father and my half brother, who never met. They were biologically related, but they never met. My father died without ever meeting my half brother, his son. So it's about their lives, which are strangely parallel, and I'm putting their stories together in this book. So they're together in this book, but they never met in life. And then after that, I'm pretty sure I know what the next novel will be. I'd like to write a novel set in a newspaper that's slowly going broke, because that's something that happens a lot, and I've seen it happen, and it's very interesting to see in my lifetime the sort of the collapse of these, or the degrading of these newsrooms that were once, full of life and full of all these different types of people. And the newspapers in Australia were very thick, and to being these very thin things that are with tiny staff. And so I'd like to write a novel set in a newsroom. But yeah.
Finally, I would like to ask you, what is your message for the Greek people concerning the pandemic?
I'm not sure that I have a particular message beyond, I hope that everybody gets vaccinated. In Sydney, we spent a lot of time locked down. In Melbourne, they spent even longer lockdown, and it was a very unfortunate experience, particularly for Melburnians. But we're 90% vaccinated. Both cities are now 90% vaccinated, and it's unlikely that we'll ever go back into lockdown again. So I'm glad that we got to that stage. Unfortunately, other things have happened that beyond the pandemic that are really that are sad to see, which is disaster capitalism. I think of the greed has been unbelievable to see during the pandemic. A lot of businesses, organizations, even universities have used the pandemic as an excuse to cut services, to cut staff, even though they're not really improving. There was no great financial need to cut as far as they have. I've seen that happen a lot in Sydney and Melbourne. And the other thing we've seen in Australia is just the greed with the property prices. Property prices in Sydney have gone up 20% in the past year, when almost half of that time we were locked in our homes. Sydney is already one of the most expensive cities to live in the world. It's a nice city. There's beautiful beaches and there's lots of things to do, but it's now like people are paying millions of dollars for a 3-bedroom house. And it's just completely out of control. So I've just seen so much greed during the pandemic, and so much. I've seen people's absolute worst, as well as people coming together to help each other. And what I would like to see in Australia and all around the world, and including Greece, is just less greed and a bit more community minded. um, initiative, not just from everyday people, but from businesses and organizations and government. I think it's been depressing to see so much disaster, what we call disaster capitalism.
Exactly. I want to thank you for the great honor to be with us today. I hope you to have as a guest in the future in our radio show program. Maybe you keep well, to be creative, and thank you for sharing all these moments, all your ideas, your life experiences, how you incarnate literally all these ideas. Thank you, really,
Thank you.
for this conversation. Maybe you keep it well.
You
You,
too.
we will send you the link of our program, of our show.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you.